Arrogant billionaire mafia boss slapped a pregnant nurse then froze when her brother walked in. Victor Romano owned the city, the police, and everyone in this VIP hospital wing. He was a billionaire mafia boss who had never been told no in his entire life. Until tonight, when a tired, heavily pregnant trauma nurse stood in the doorway of the operating room and refused to let his armed men inside. Victor didn't argue. He just raised his hand and struck her. She hit the ground hard, her arms instantly wrapping around her swollen belly to protect her unborn child. Victor sneered, adjusting his custom diamond cuffs, preparing to step right over her as if she were trash. But Victor never took that step. The blood drained completely from the ruthless billionaire's face. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Standing in the doorway wasn't hospital security. It was the nurse's older brother. The deadliest, untraceable syndicate assassin in the country, the exact ghost Victor had spent $5 million trying to kill last week. And his cold, dead eyes were staring right at the red mark on his little sister's cheek. To understand the full scope of the fallout, we must return to the initial spark of the scandal. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. The fluorescent lights of the VIP surgical wing hummed with a sterile, unforgiving glare. It was 2 a.m., the hour when the rest of the city was asleep, but for Chloe, the nightmare was just beginning. At 7 months pregnant, her lower back ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, but she refused to sit. She stood firmly in front of the double doors of operating room 4, her arms crossed over the swell of her belly. Inside, surgeons were desperately trying to save a 17-year-old boy who had been caught in the crossfire of a syndicate turf war. Nobody goes in. Nobody comes out. Those were the hospital director's strict orders. The soft ding of the private elevator shattered the quiet. Chloe stiffened. The heavy steel doors slid open, and the air in the corridor instantly turned freezing. Victor Romano stepped onto the floor. He was a man who wore his billions like a weapon. Dressed in a charcoal, bespoke suit that clung perfectly to his broad frame, Victor possessed a terrifying, arrogant beauty. But his dark eyes were hollow, completely devoid of empathy. He was the undisputed king of the city's underworld, a mafia boss who bought judges, politicians, and police chiefs before breakfast. Flanking him were 4 massive guards, their hands resting ominously on the bulges beneath their suit jackets. Victor didn't even look at Chloe. He strode directly toward the operating room, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum. "Excuse me," Chloe said, her voice trembling slightly before she forced it into steel. She stepped directly into his path. "You can't be here. This is a restricted, sterile wing." Victor finally stopped. He looked down at her, his gaze flicking over her pale face, her blue scrubs, and the undeniable curve of her pregnancy. A cruel, dismissive smirk curled the corner of his mouth. "Move aside, sweetheart," Victor murmured, his voice as smooth as crushed velvet and twice as dangerous. "The rat bleeding out on that table owes me money. I'm here to collect." "He is a patient in critical condition," Chloe said, lifting her chin, refusing to be intimidated by the suffocating power rolling off him. "And I am his nurse. You are not going in there." Victor let out a soft, dark laugh. He adjusted his diamond cufflink, his patience evaporating in an instant. He was a man who had never heard the word no in his entire life, let alone from a tired, pregnant hospital worker. "I own this hospital," Victor said softly, leaning in until Chloe could smell the expensive scotch and mint on his breath. "Which means I own you. Now, get out of my way before I have my men throw you down the stairwell." "I'm calling security," she whispered, reaching for the radio clipped to her hip. Victor didn't even blink. He just raised his hand. The slap sounded like a gunshot in the quiet corridor. The force of the blow was devastating. The world spun violently as pain exploded across Chloe's cheekbone. Her feet slipped on the polished floor, and she went down hard. Instinct overrode everything. As she fell, Chloe twisted her body, taking the brutal impact entirely on her shoulder and hip, her arms instantly wrapping around her swollen belly to shield her unborn child from the linoleum. She gasped, her vision swimming with black spots, the metallic taste of blood filling her mouth. Victor stood over her, his expression bored. He stepped closer, preparing to casually walk right over her curled, trembling body as if she were nothing more than garbage in his path. "Open the doors," Victor ordered his men. But his guards didn't move. Victor turned, annoyed, but the insult died in his throat. The blood completely drained from the ruthless billionaire's face. He froze, his polished shoe hovering inches from Chloe's arm. The temperature in the ward didn't just drop, it plummeted into absolute, suffocating ice. Standing at the end of the hallway were two men. They hadn't taken the elevator. They had come up through the shadows of the stairwell, moving in absolute silence. The man on the left was Gabriel, Chloe's older brother. He was the most lethal, untraceable syndicate assassin on the continent, a ghost Victor had spent $5 million trying to hunt down and kill just last week. Gabriel was dressed in all black, a pump-action shotgun resting casually against his thigh. His dead, emotionless eyes were locked onto the red, swelling handprint on his little sister's cheek. But it wasn't Gabriel who made Victor Romano take a terrified step backward. It was the man standing next to him, Cassius. 6 months ago, Cassius had disappeared into the underground to fight a war he couldn't let touch Chloe. He was the Underboss, a man made of brutal violence and calculated wrath. And he was the man Chloe had loved with a fierce, consuming desperation. The man who didn't know she was carrying his child. Cassius's striking, aristocratic face was normally a mask of perfect, cold control. But right now, his slate-gray eyes were wide, taking in the scene. He looked at Chloe on the floor. He saw her ripped scrubs. He saw the blood on her lip. And then, his gaze dropped to the undeniable, beautiful swell of her 7-month pregnant belly, wrapped safely in her protective arms. A choked, raw sound ripped from Cassius's chest, a sound of sheer devastation mixed with an earth-shattering, demonic rage. "Cassius," Chloe whispered, tears finally spilling over her lashes. Cassius didn't look at Victor. He moved so fast he was nothing but a blur of tailored dark wool and lethal intent, dropping to his knees on the hard floor right beside her. His large, scarred hands hovered over her, shaking violently, terrified that touching her might break her further. "Chloe," Cassius breathed, his voice breaking in a way that would have brought the entire underworld to a standstill. "My God, Tesoro, you're..." He gently cradled her face, his thumb swiping away the blood on her lip with an agonizing, worshipful tenderness. He pressed his forehead against hers, inhaling her scent like he had been suffocating for 6 months and finally found air. Then, trembling, he moved his hand down, resting his large palm reverently against her swollen stomach. The baby kicked instantly against his touch. Cassius squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear escaping his lashes, his entire body trembling with the overwhelming weight of it. She was alive. She was carrying his child. And someone had hurt them. When Cassius finally opened his eyes and slowly stood up, the tender, heartbroken lover was gone. The monster had arrived. He slowly pulled off his suit jacket, letting it drop to the floor, his slate-gray eyes locking onto Victor Romano with the promise of a slow, agonizing slaughter. "Gabriel," Cassius said, his voice a dark, vibrating purr that made the guards physically recoil. "Lock the stairwell. Turn off the cameras." Gabriel racked a shell into the shotgun, a terrifying, savage smile spreading across his face. "With pleasure." Cassius unbuttoned his cuffs, rolling up his sleeves to reveal the dark ink of his syndicate tattoos. He tilted his head at the billionaire, who was now backing away, sweating, his empire and his money entirely useless. "You have exactly 30 seconds to pray, Romano," Cassius whispered, the lethal devotion in his eyes burning like hellfire. Because the hands that just touched the mother of my child are coming off first. Shoot him. Kill them both. Victor shrieked, his polished veneer shattering into sheer panic. He scrambled backward, throwing one of his own men into Cassius's path as a human shield. The 4 guards drew their weapons, but they were corporate thugs used to intimidating civilians. They were not prepared for the ghosts of the syndicate. Gabriel didn't even blink. He swung the heavy stock of the shotgun, shattering the jaw of the closest guard with a sickening crack before driving his boot into the man's chest, sending him crashing through a glass supply cart. Cassius didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. He moved with the terrifying, predatory grace of a panther unleashed from a cage. A guard lunged at him with a drawn combat knife. Cassius sidestepped the blade with inches to spare, caught the man's wrist, and twisted. The bone snapped with a loud pop. Before the guard could even scream, Cassius drove a devastating elbow into his temple, dropping him completely unconscious to the linoleum. The 3rd guard pulled his trigger, but Gabriel's shotgun roared first, deafening in the enclosed space, blowing the guard's weapon clean out of his hand in a shower of sparks and shattered metal. The man fell to his knees, screaming, clutching his mangled fingers. It took exactly 12 seconds. For highly paid enforcers were bleeding, broken, and groaning on the floor. Chloe pressed herself against the wall, her hands trembling over her stomach. She should have been terrified by the violence. As a nurse, her instinct was to heal, to stop the bleeding. But watching Cassius dismantle the men who had threatened her child didn't bring her fear. It brought a dark, overwhelming wave of absolute safety. Victor Romano was backed against the heavy double doors of the operating room. There was nowhere left to run. The billionaire's chest heaved, his expensive charcoal suit suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. Cassius walked toward him. He didn't rush. Every step was slow, deliberate, and soaked in executioner's dread. Cassius, wait, listen to me. Victor babbled, holding his hands up, his voice cracking. It was a mistake. I didn't know she belonged to you. Name your price. 10 million? 20? I'll wire it to your offshore accounts right now. Just let me walk to the elevator. Cassius stopped inches from the billionaire. He tilted his head, his slate-gray eyes as cold as a frozen grave. You think my family has a price tag? Cassius whispered, the sheer softness of his voice infinitely more terrifying than a shout. Cassius's hand shot out like a viper. He wrapped his large, scarred fingers around Victor's right wrist, the exact hand that had struck Chloe. Victor screamed as Cassius's grip tightened, crushing the delicate bones. You touch what is mine, Cassius murmured, staring directly into Victor's terrified eyes, and I take the hand. That is the rule. With a brutal, unhesitating violently twist, Cassius snapped Victor's arm completely backward. The billionaire unleashed a high-pitched, agonizing shriek, collapsing to his knees as his arm hung at a grotesque angle. He sobbed, cradling his broken limb, completely stripped of his power, his money, and his arrogance. Cassius stared down at him with absolute disgust. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pristine white handkerchief, and meticulously wiped Victor's blood from his knuckles. He tossed the ruined cloth onto Victor's lap. Gabriel, Cassius said without looking away from the weeping billionaire. Gabriel racked another shell into his shotgun, the metallic slide echoing loudly. Yeah, boss. Drag him down to the loading dock. Put him in the trunk. If he bleeds on the upholstery, break his other arm. Gabriel smirked, grabbing the billionaire by his expensive collar and dragging him down the hall like a sack of garbage. Come on, Your Majesty. Let's go for a ride. The corridor suddenly fell dead silent, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Cassius turned around. The lethal, cold-blooded executioner vanished the second his eyes found Chloe. She was still on the floor, trying to push herself up, her breathing shallow as the adrenaline began to crash. Before she could manage it, Cassius was there. He dropped to his knees in the blood and broken glass, entirely heedless of his tailored trousers. "Don't move, Tesoro," he breathed, his voice rough and laced with panic. "Let me." He slid his strong arms beneath her knees and behind her back, lifting her effortlessly against his solid chest. Chloe gasped, her hands instinctively grabbing the lapels of his shirt. He was so warm. He smelled exactly as she remembered: cedarwood, rain, and danger. The dam inside her finally broke, and a choked sob tore from her throat. "You left me," she cried, her fists twisting his shirt, hitting his chest weakly. "6 months, Cassius. You just vanished." "I know," he whispered, burying his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot against her skin. "I know, and I will spend the rest of my life begging for your forgiveness. I left to dismantle the southern syndicates. I burned down half the city to make it safe for you, only to come back and find the devil standing in your hallway." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. His thumb gently, agonizingly traced the edge of the red mark blossoming on her cheekbone. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked frantically beneath his skin. "He hurt you," Cassius choked out, his eyes dropping to her pregnant belly. "I wasn't here, and he hurt our baby." "We're okay," Chloe whispered, her hand covering his where it rested against her cheek. "I protected them. I protected our child." A shudder ran through Cassius's massive frame. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes as if her heartbeat was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. "Never again," Cassius vowed, his voice a deep, gravelly promise that vibrated through her chest. "You are never working another shift in this place. You are never walking alone. You are mine, Chloe. Every breath you take, every beat of that child's heart, it belongs to me. I am taking you home." Cassius stood up, holding her tightly against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all. He didn't look back at the operating room. He didn't look at the mess on the floor. He simply carried his world out of the darkness and into the elevator, fully prepared to wage war against anyone who ever dared to look at them again. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid shut, instantly cutting off the sterile glare of the hospital and sealing them in quiet, humming darkness. Cassius still hadn't put her down. He held Chloe tight against his chest, his powerful arms locked around her as if he were terrified she might vanish into thin air the second he let go. The adrenaline that had kept Chloe standing for the last 10 minutes was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the sharp, throbbing ache in her cheek. She rested her head in the crook of his neck, closing her eyes. She could hear the heavy, rapid thumping of his heart beneath his ruined dress shirt. It was the only sign that the cold, calculating underboss was actually shaken to his core. "I'm ruining your shirt," Chloe whispered, her voice raspy, acutely aware of the blood from her split lips staining his collar. Cassius let out a breath that sounded like a ragged prayer. He pressed his lips to the crown of her hair, inhaling deeply. "I will buy 1,000 more if it means you keep bleeding on me instead of the floor. You are freezing, Tesoro." The elevator chimed, the doors sliding open to the underground parking garage. It didn't look like a hospital garage anymore. It looked like a military checkpoint. 3 massive, heavily armored black SUVs were idling in the concrete bay. At least a dozen men in dark suits, heavily armed and hypervigilant, snapped to attention the second Cassius stepped out. They didn't speak. They didn't stare. They simply bowed their heads in absolute deference to their boss and the woman in his arms. One of the men, a towering enforcer with scars tracking up his neck, sprinted forward and threw open the heavy rear door of the center SUV. Cassius ducked inside, sliding into the luxurious, dimly lit leather interior and carefully settled Chloe onto the wide seat next to him. Before she could even adjust, he was pulling a thick, cashmere blanket from a hidden compartment and wrapping it securely around her trembling shoulders. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing them in a soundproof cocoon. The engine rumbled to life, and the convoy instantly surged forward into the rainy night. For a long moment, the only sound in the car was the soft hum of the tires against the wet asphalt. The tinted windows blocked out the city lights, leaving them bathed in the warm, ambient glow of the dashboard. Cassius turned to her. He reached out, his massive hands trembling slightly, and gently cupped her face. He tilted her head toward the light, his slate-gray eyes meticulously analyzing the bruising on her cheekbone and the dried blood on her lip. His jaw tightened so hard it looked like it might snap. "I should have killed him in the hallway," Cassius murmured, his voice laced with a dark, terrifying regret. "Breaking his arm wasn't enough. He touched you." "Cassius, stop," Chloe said softly, reaching up to cover his hand with hers. "I'm okay. I'm a nurse, remember? I know how to take a fall. I protected the baby." At the mention of the baby, Cassius completely froze. The lethal Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man looking at a miracle he didn't know he deserved. He slowly lowered his gaze to the swell of her belly beneath the blanket. The harsh lines of his face softened into an expression of absolute reverence. He looked at her, silently asking for permission. Chloe gave a small, tearful nod. Cassius slipped his hand beneath the edge of the cashmere blanket, resting his large, warm palm flat against her stomach. The contrast was startling, the hands of a man who ruled a criminal empire, so rough and scarred, touching her with a gentleness that felt like religion. As if sensing his father's presence, the baby gave a strong, sudden kick directly against Cassius's palm. Cassius sharply inhaled, his eyes flying up to meet hers, wide and entirely unguarded. A single, silent tear slipped down his cheek, disappearing into the dark stubble of his jaw. 7 months, Chloe whispered, her throat tightening. "I tried to tell you the night you left. I went to the estate, but your men said you were already gone." "If I had known," Cassius choked out, leaning his forehead against hers, his thumb gently stroking the curve of her belly. "God, Chloe. If I had known you were carrying my child, I would have burned the city to the ground 6 months ago and never left your side. I thought I was protecting you by staying away. I thought my world would taint you." "Your world is already mine," she said fiercely, gripping his collar. "Gabriel is my brother. You are the father of my child. I don't care about the syndicates. I don't care about the danger. I just want you." Cassius shifted closer, wrapping his arm around her waist and pulling her flush against his side. He buried his face in her hair, holding her so tightly she could feel the desperate, protective energy radiating from his every muscle. "You have me," he vowed, his voice dropping to a gravelly, absolute promise. "You have every piece of me, for the rest of my life. You are never stepping foot in a hospital again. You are never taking another shift. I am building a nursery in the center of the estate, and I am putting a wall of guns between you and the rest of the world." Chloe let her eyes drift shut, resting her head against his chest. The exhaustion finally overtook the adrenaline. For the first time in 6 months, she didn't feel the crushing weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. "Where are we going?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep as the SUV smoothly accelerated onto the private highway. Cassius pressed a long, lingering kiss to her bruised temple, his hand still resting protectively over their child. "Home," he whispered into the dark. "We're going home to Zorro. And tomorrow, I'm buying you a ring." The heavy purr of the SUV's engine shifted as they slowed, easing onto a smooth, winding driveway. Chloe blinked, struggling to pull herself from the heavy, exhausted sleep that had finally claimed her. Through the tinted window, she saw towering wrought iron gates swinging open, flanked by stone pillars and men carrying assault rifles. Beyond the gates lay the Romano estate, not Victor's, but the true seat of the family's power, a sprawling, modern fortress of glass, dark steel, and ancient oak trees, completely hidden from the rest of the world. Cassius didn't wait for the driver to open the door. As soon as the vehicle glided to a stop beneath the grand portico, he was moving. He scooped Chloe into his arms once more, ignoring her soft, sleepy protests that she could walk. "You're not walking," he murmured, his voice a low, soothing rumble in the cool night air. "You're not lifting a finger. Let me take care of you, Tesoro. He carried her through the massive double doors of the mansion. The interior was breathtaking, a masterpiece of dark marble, vaulted ceilings, and sweeping staircases, but Cassius didn't pause to let her admire it. He bypassed the main floor entirely, taking a private, glass-walled elevator straight to the master wing on the top floor. When the doors opened, Chloe realized just how insulated his world was. The master suite was the size of a penthouse, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass overlooking the dark, stormy ocean. A massive fire crackled in a black stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the luxurious space. Cassius carried her into the ensuite bathroom, a room crafted entirely of dark slate and gold fixtures. He set her down gently on the edge of a deep, freestanding marble tub. Kneeling before her, Cassius stripped off his ruined suit jacket and tossed it aside. His dress shirt was stained with blood, Victor's blood, her blood, the hospital's chaos. He ignored it, his absolute focus resting entirely on her. With agonizing care, his large, calloused hands reached up to untie her messy hair, letting it fall around her shoulders. "I have a private physician coming to check the baby," Cassius said softly, his thumbs gently grazing her jawline, carefully avoiding the swelling on her cheek. "Dr. Rossi. He's family. He doesn't ask questions, and he never leaves the estate. But first, I need to get this hospital off your skin." Chloe nodded slowly, her throat tight. She watched him turn on the polished gold faucets, testing the water temperature with his wrist before pouring in a rich, soothing bath oil that smelled of lavender and amber. When the tub was full, Cassius turned back to her. He didn't ask her to undress. He did it for her, his touches so reverent it made her breath hitch. He unclipped her badge, tossed it into the trash, and gently peeled away the stiff, blue scrubs. When she was finally bare, Cassius's breath caught. He didn't look at her with lust. He looked at her with a profound, earth-shattering awe. His eyes traced the beautiful, heavy curve of her pregnancy, taking in the physical evidence of the child they had created. He slowly reached out, tracing a faint stretch mark on her hip as if it were a battle scar he intended to worship. "You are so beautiful," he breathed, his voice raw. "A goddess carrying my heir." He lifted her gently into the warm water. The heat instantly seeped into her aching muscles, drawing a long, shuddering sigh from her lips. Cassius rolled up his sleeves, grabbed a soft sponge, and began to wash her. It was an intimate, vulnerable surrender. The deadliest man in the city, an underboss who had just snapped a billionaire's arm without blinking, was kneeling on the hard slate floor, meticulously washing the dried blood from her hands and the hospital grime from her feet. "Gabriel is staying in the East Wing," Cassius murmured, his deep voice filling the quiet room as he rinsed the soap from her shoulders. "He has already fortified the perimeter. I'm pulling every loyal soldier I have to surround this property. By sunrise, Victor's faction will know what I did to him." "Will there be a war?" Chloe asked softly, opening her eyes to look at him. Cassius paused. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, illuminating the cold, unapologetic monster that lived just beneath his skin. "Yes," Cassius said, his tone devoid of fear. "Victor is arrogant, and he has a private army. When they find him bleeding in the trunk of a car on the loading dock, they will retaliate. But it won't be a long war, Chloe." He leaned in, his wet hands gently framing her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "Because I am going to slaughter every single man who wears his crest," Cassius vowed, his slate-gray eyes burning with a terrifying devotion. "I am going to dismantle his empire piece by piece, and I am going to lay the ashes at your feet. No one touches the mother of my child and lives to see another week." Chloe didn't flinch. 6 months ago, the violence of his world had terrified her. Now, looking into the eyes of the man who would burn the earth to keep her safe, she only felt an overwhelming, consuming love. "Come here," she whispered, lifting her wet hands from the water and tangling them in his dark hair. She pulled him down. Cassius didn't hesitate. He leaned over the edge of the tub, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted of desperate relief and fiery possession. It wasn't gentle, it was acclaiming, a physical brand that erased the last 6 months of agonizing separation. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathless. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed from the bedroom doors, breaking the heavy tension. Cassius, Gabriel's muffled voice called out from the hallway, completely devoid of his usual sarcastic edge. "You need to see this. Now." Cassius's head snapped toward the door, his eyes narrowing. He grabbed a massive, fluffy towel, wrapping it securely around Chloe and lifting her from the tub. He carried her into the bedroom, setting her gently in the center of the massive, silk-sheeted bed, tucking the covers around her. "Stay here," he ordered softly, kissing her forehead before turning toward the door. Cassius pulled open the heavy oak doors. Gabriel was standing in the hallway, holding a sleek black tablet. The assassin's face was grim. "Victor's men didn't wait for sunrise," Gabriel said flatly, handing the tablet to Cassius. Chloe watched from the bed as Cassius looked at the screen. The muscles in his broad back went completely rigid. "They hit the hospital," Gabriel continued, his voice tight. "10 minutes after we left. They firebombed the VIP wing looking for you. The entire floor is gone." Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Her ward. Her coworkers." Cassius slowly lowered the tablet. He didn't yell. He didn't throw it. The absolute, dead silence radiating from him was infinitely worse. He slowly turned his head to look at Chloe, realizing exactly how close he had come to losing her, how close Victor had come to burning his pregnant mate alive. When Cassius turned back to Gabriel, his eyes were completely black. "Arm the men," Cassius whispered, the sound like a blade scraping across a tombstone. "We aren't waiting for them to come to us. We end the Romano bloodline tonight." Cassius did not put on another suit. When he emerged from the walk-in armory 10 minutes later, he was dressed entirely in tactical black, his chest wrapped in Kevlar, heavily armed with matte black weaponry that caught no light. He looked exactly like what he was, the Reaper of the Underworld. He walked back to the edge of the bed where Chloe sat huddled beneath the silk sheets. He reached out, his leather-gloved hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb brushing safely below her bruise. "Sleep," he commanded softly, the violent edge in his voice softening only for her. "Dr. Rossi is outside the door. Gabriel's men have the perimeter. When you wake up, the city will be ours, and Victor Romano will be nothing but a ghost story." "Come back to me," Chloe whispered, her hand wrapping tightly over his thick wrist. "Promise me." Cassius leaned down, pressing a hard, desperate kiss to her lips. "I am tethered to your soul, Chloe. The devil himself couldn't keep me from walking back through that door." He pulled away, his face hardening into absolute stone, and walked out into the night. The hours crawled by in agonizing slow motion. Chloe lay awake, watching the storm rage over the dark ocean through the bulletproof glass, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. From miles away, over the crashing of the waves, she swore she could hear the faint, echoing booms of explosions echoing across the city's skyline. It wasn't a war. It was an extermination. Just as the first slivers of pale morning light began to break across the horizon, painting the storm clouds in bruised shades of purple and gold, the heavy bedroom doors finally clicked open. Chloe bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. Cassius stood in the doorway. He was breathing heavily, his tactical vest discarded. His black shirt was torn, his knuckles were split and coated in dried blood, and there was a streak of ash across his jawline. But his slate-gray eyes were clear, bright, and completely focused on her. Standing in the hallway behind him was Gabriel, leaning against the wall, twirling a tactical knife with a tired, satisfied smirk. Gabriel caught Chloe's eye, gave a single, respectful nod to assure her it was done, and quietly closed the doors, leaving them alone. Cassius didn't take a step toward the bed. He stopped in the center of the room, looking down at his hands, disgusted by the violence coating his skin. "It's done," Cassius rasped, his voice shredded from the smoke and the shouting. "Victor's compounds are ashes. His lieutenants are dead. The Romano name no longer exists in this city." Chloe didn't hesitate. She threw the heavy silk covers aside and stood up, walking across the cold slate floor in the oversized t-shirt he had given her. "Don't touch me, Tesoro," Cassius warned, taking a step back, his chest heaving. "I'm covered in blood. I need to wash it off before I can." Chloe cut him off by throwing her arms directly around his neck, burying her face into his ash-scented chest. She didn't care about the grime or the blood. She only cared that his heart was beating strong and steady beneath her ear. Cassius surrendered with a shuddering exhale. His massive arms wrapped around her, pulling her completely off the floor, burying his face in the crook of her neck as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. He carried her to the bed, collapsing onto the mattress beside her. He kicked off his heavy boots but refused to let her go, pulling her flush against his side. Chloe rested her head on his chest, her hand trailing over the ink of his syndicate tattoos. "I told you I was bringing you home," Cassius murmured, his voice thick with exhaustion and overwhelming love. He shifted, reaching into the pocket of his tactical pants. His bruised, blood-stained fingers pulled out a small, sleek black velvet box. Chloe gasped softly as he popped it open. Resting on the dark velvet was a ring, a breathtaking, flawless radiant cut diamond flanked by crushed obsidian, forged to look as beautiful and dangerous as the man offering it. Cassius didn't get down on one knee. He was already right where he belonged, lying beside the mother of his child. He took the ring and slid it onto her trembling left hand. It was a perfect fit. 6 months ago, I was a soldier fighting in the dark, Cassius whispered, pressing a reverent kiss to her knuckles, right over the heavy diamond. Today, I am a king. And this city belongs to you. No one will ever touch you. No one will ever threaten our child. You are the queen of this empire, Chloe, for as long as I have breath in my lungs. Chloe looked down at the ring, then up into the fierce, devoted eyes of the deadliest man in the world. The nightmare of the hospital, the fear of the last 6 months, it all melted away into the quiet warmth of the dawn. "I love you," she whispered, leaning up to press her lips to his. Cassius smiled, a true, devastatingly handsome smile that finally chased the shadows from the room. He rested his large hand protectively over her swollen belly, feeling his child kick against his palm as the morning sun finally broke over the water. "Forever, Tesoro," Cassius promised. "Forever."